For many years, people in Boston have been pushing for better and more affordable service on the MBTA. There have been some victories along the way, but the pandemic and the resulting drop in ridership have resulted in some difficult choices, resulting in the T's plan for service cuts. But there's strong pushback from local communities and transportation advocates. Joining us are two of those advocates, the Director of Transit-Oriented Development and T Riders Union at Alternatives for Community and Environment, Mela Bush-Miles, and from the LivableStreets Alliance, the Community Engagement Manager, Kristiana Lachiusa. Thank you both very much for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
I want to start with Kristiana because there's a pushback campaign and there's branding with this as well, that transit is essential. So what's the point of that branding?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So Transit is Essential is our name, and our website is transitisessential.org, so definitely check it out. But the name came from the idea that essential workers are needing and relying on the T now during COVID-19 as before to get to where they need to go, whether that's to their jobs, whether it's to the grocery store, whether it's to healthcare appointments. And further, that the people who are providing the service, the MBTA workers, are also essential. Those are essential jobs, and they're allowing everyone to get where they need to go. So, all essential.
I want to turn Mela Bush-Miles. The T's general point here is that they're cutting back where the ridership is the lowest, and they're keeping most of that service where it's higher. To take one example here, you have the Fairmont Indigo line. There are some cutbacks, but there are some things being retained on that line. How do you balance those two?
Well, there's been some improvements over this year, but they're intending on cutting back weekend service starting in January. And because this is a line that does what they call reverse commutes, people travel within the corridor, cutting off weekend service is really a bad idea because people need that to get to essential things like supermarkets and places like that. So we're really concerned about that.
Kristiana, what about you? I mean, the general message from the T is, if the ridership's heaviest, the cuts will be the smallest. In some other places, maybe even bordering on redundant services, there will be heavier cuts. It sounds reasonable in the aggregate, but how do you read it?
Yeah, I mean, improving efficiency overall, there are definitely some tweaks that are good and could be useful, but broader strokes, why are we basing our long-term how our T works based on current ridership levels? I think it's really frustrating to see, cutting 25 bus lines, cutting all weekend commuter rail service, removing all ferry service. Like, these are really significant, drastic cuts. And it'll take years to rehire the folks that'll be laid off at the T who are currently drivers and people fixing these vehicles, maintaining them. We're setting ourselves up for a 3 to 5 year recovery timeline, and COVID-19 is going to end. It's been great to see some really positive results from the vaccine, and so COVID will end sometime in the next year or two, and the T will not be there to help people when they're ready to come back to work.
Mela, for the most part, if these cuts were approved, you'd see a lot of lines where the buses or the trains would run less frequently. I guess that means they might get more crowded. How responsible is it to do that at a time like this, given what's happening with the pandemic?
Over the time that we've been dealing with the pandemic, we have seen people being crowded and the T kept having to make adjustments. And people are really afraid of what's going to happen if they're causing crowding now and cutting off bus lines. These bus lines, people who are on a bus or a train or a ferry have to be on that. And the rest of the economy depends upon those folks who are traveling around to get to essential services, to have those services continue to run. So we're really concerned about causing crowding, infecting more people, making more people sick, and getting the customer, the rider confidence up, back up so that people will continue to use public transit and not impact like climate change by getting into old cars and things.
Kristiana, I know you talked about permanent repercussions, at least from the cuts. The T says the cuts themselves are not permanent. So where does the line get blurred between those two?
I think the permanence comes in when you talk about laying off workers. Like, it's one thing to move buses around or, you know, adjust service hours, but it's another thing when you are thinking about really cutting service in a significant way where you don't need as many employees and are trying to, you know, save money and so don't want to pay for as many employees. So I think that's where, for me, the permanent cuts come into this. Yeah.
Mela, you're also concerned about the environmental impact. What do you see?
Well, what we see is that in certain zip codes in Boston, the life expectancy is lower than in other zip codes. And in our environmental justice communities like Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, so on, the life expectancy is lower than in more affluent zip codes. So the climate impact and the environmental impact is going to be more severe in these areas because more people will get back into their cars. They'll be taking Ubers or whatever it is to try and get to where they have to go. They have no other choice. And it's going to have a severe repercussions on those specific communities. And they're also, they're also cutting out buses, some of the buses in these communities, and these are cut, the bus line will be completely cut. There's a bus line that runs through Dorchester, number 18. It's on a list for cut, amputated, gone.
Kristiana, what about the residue of these cuts? Because, you know, once people get used to doing something else for getting around, they might continue it even when other circumstances change. Do you think that's going to be an issue?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, which is another reason why these are pretty scary to think about. I mean, if people, again, depending on their circumstances, if they're able to afford cars, they'll probably buy cars. And then once you have made that significant investment, there's no reason to not use that. And as we know from before COVID, congestion was already a huge problem. And so as we see people shifting modes and switching to cars, it's going to further exacerbate our already filled roads. And go back to what Mela was saying about the air quality of the added congestion means worse greenhouse gas emissions, worse particulate matter in the air that leads to asthma and sort of all the health effects that come from those. And so it's all connected, and yeah, it's really, really unfortunate to see, and has, I think, bigger effects beyond just transit riders, because when all those people, the 60 plus people who are riding on a bus are now in cars, that's 60 more cars on the road, which makes everyone feel the impact of that cut service.
No, there's no question, I think, that the T is short of money because of the pandemic and its repercussions. But what about getting other sources of money? Is there much hope for that?
Currently, the T has the CARES Act money that they're depending on to get through this fiscal year. And then there are some amendments up at the legislative level that we're hoping to see passed. And there's also federal infusions of money, but as was stated in a Globe article a few days ago, this infusion of money may not be used in the short term, and they're trying to hold on to it for the long term for later. And we can't trust the MBTA to actually keep their word when they take our money, our tax dollars, and put it aside in some spot like they did with the lockbox money that they got from the fare increase in 2016, which is still sitting there and never ended up being used for customer-facing improvements. So we can't really trust that, and we're really concerned that they're not going to use the monies that come in the short term because they're saying they want to save it for later.
Yeah, and just to build off that a little bit, Mela, which really good points, and Chris, there's two pieces. There's the sustainably fund in the short term, but also the long term. The T was already in deep financial trouble before COVID-19 hit, And COVID-19 just exacerbated those existing problems with the lack of revenue. So I think a lot of the question about funding, and especially at the legislature, is how can we have better long-term funding solution that isn't just relying on fare revenue, which we can now clearly see is not sustainable, doesn't work well, and puts the onus on riders who in many cases are the least able to pay.
And that $1 billion.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mela, please.
The $1 billion fare transformation, new fare collection project that the T is still trying to move forward, $1 billion. That needs to be set aside. Fix the gates or leave them open and use counters as people tap in and go through so they don't have to keep maintaining those gates. There are ways around this fiscal crisis that the MBTA finds themselves in. And we've been asking them to take another look at the fare transformation project, which is a new fare collection system that they want to implement over the next year and a half or two.
Well, thank you both very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, Mela Bush-Miles and Kristiana Lachiusa. We'll have more news in just a moment.